Well, over the last weeks and months, there's been a real focus on the 100th anniversary of the beginnings of World War I. And most of the discussion, and I should say, I don't know how much it's been in the United States. There hasn't been a whole lot in the United States, but in Europe it's discussed all the time. Because most of World War I was fought in a small area right around here, between France and Germany. But the point to looking at World War I is you have these very simple observations that are made, where people say, are we headed for the same situation? And you hear this aphorism, which is a somewhat useless comment, but it's repeated over and over and over, which is, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. And you know, the lessons of history are not what most people think. And what I want to do is to demonstrate to you why it is that we're in a fight today, which is a continuation, almost an unbroken continuation, of war policies going back to the latter part of the 19th century. And that the real issue here is that unless we rid the planet of the concept of an empire, unless we establish regimes of sovereign nation states that function as republics, largely driven by our own nation, unless we do that, we're going to have a nuclear or thermonuclear World War III at some point in the maybe the weeks or days ahead, certainly within several months is the way things are going. So this is not just a history class or an object lesson, look how stupid they were then, we're acting just as stupid now, therefore ipso facto there's going to be war. It's that most people don't understand what causes wars. They don't understand why nations go to war. If you ask people today, you know, the president spends a lot of time attacking President Putin and making some very nasty and quite frankly, uneducated and foolish comments about the Russian president. Do you think they don't see this? They don't hear this? I mean, there's one case that I'll just give you an example. One of the witches at the State Department, a spokeswoman named Psaki, they're promoting these women who look like high school girls who are bloodthirsty lunatics. Maria Harf is another one. Samantha Power, who's our UN ambassador, is another one. But this Psaki said the Russians are massing 20,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. And that's why we're concerned about Russia and Putin. And she goes into a whole thing. And then a reporter said, well, but these troops are 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. That's 600 miles. That's not exactly poised for a strike. And she said, well, our assessment is that they're right on the border and they're prepared to move. And then the reporter said, well, how far back should they be to not be a threat to Ukraine? In Siberia? You know, here's Ukraine, here's 600 kilometers. You know, here's where the reporter was asking, should they be posted here to not be a threat to Ukraine? Now, the point is that it's a stupid statement. And most of what we're hearing about Putin in the United States press is vile lies. And the question has to be raised, why are we subjected to this kind of propaganda? Why is it that on September 4th and 5th, NATO is going to have a summit in Wales? And the topic of the summit is going to be expanding NATO eastward up to the Russian border. Now, some of you who are older probably remember what NATO was formed to do. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What was NATO set up for? To stop the expansion of the Soviet Union at a point at which the Soviet Union had taken over all of Eastern Europe. And so the West formed an alliance to prevent Russia from taking West Germany, Austria, France, Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed 24 years ago. Russia went into a terrible crisis in the early 90s, provoked largely by the effort of the West to impose shock therapy on Russia. Russia lost a large portion of its population. Older people died early because of hunger, disease. A lot of the younger people who could left Russia. There was a real shrinkage of the population of Russia. And there were agreements signed by George Herbert Walker Bush and by Clinton with Russia that said NATO would not expand eastward. And yet NATO has now added Poland. We now have NATO units in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're trying to incorporate Ukraine. They're in Romania. So NATO has moved closer and closer to Russia. And what has Russia done to deserve this? Well, one of the things the Russians have been doing is they're fighting terrorists. They're fighting Islamic jihadist terrorists in Chechnya, in Georgia, South Ossetia, and other areas that are part of the Russian underbelly. And these terrorists are the same terrorists that we're supposedly fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. But when the Russians fight them, they're attacked for human rights violations. So the situation facing Russia is one in which, from their viewpoint, put yourself in the Russian viewpoint. Actually, let's think from the Russian viewpoint. What would you think? Well, I don't have the U.S. and Mexico up here. What would you think if instead of 60,000 Honduras and El Salvadorian children, you had 60,000 Russian troops moved to Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez and to Nuevo Laredo? Do you think there might be some concern in the United States about that? Do you remember we almost had nuclear war in 1962 when the Russians put some missiles in Cuba? Now, nations have a sense of defending their sovereignty, defending their people. That's all that Putin has been doing. And I'll go through in a few moments I'll go through right now. What happened in Ukraine? You had a government there that was broke. You've had bad governments in most of these countries after the Soviet Union fell because they had a problem. They didn't have capital. They didn't have the capability of building their countries, and they were hit immediately with shock therapy. Now, what shock therapy means is you can't spend state money to build the economy. You have to bring in private companies. But what happens with private companies? Why would a U.S. firm buy up a Russian railroad or a Ukrainian subway system or a loading dock on the Black Sea? Out of the goodness of their heart because they want to develop these countries? No, it's to make money. And so they insisted that wages be driven down, that pensions be cut, that the Soviet Union went from having everything paid for by the state to nothing paid for by the state. That's why people died. You can't have that kind of transition. You need to have a transition which takes the elements of an economy that can function and puts them immediately in some kind of productive work as the basis of then driving the whole economy forward with the most advanced technology. And instead of doing that, shock therapy means you go in with a bunch of accountants and say, oh, you're paying $100 a month pensions, but you can't afford that in your budget, so we're going to cut it to 50 or 25. And someone might say, but people will starve. Well, you should have thought of that. You should have built your economy. You shouldn't have had communism. You blew it. We're going to put you under sound fiscal management. And so that's what happened in Eastern Europe. So in Ukraine, they'd gone up and down and back and forth, and they had a George Soros-funded revolt that put in a government with Yulia Tymoshenko, which looted the country like crazy. She became a billionaire. And then she was driven out and replaced by a guy named Yanukovych. And Yanukovych had his own problems. He wasn't that much better, but he was popularly elected. He was re-elected. And he was given a choice. He was asked to join the European Union, to have Ukraine join the European Union. And he looked at what was happening in the European Union. Now, what was happening in the European Union? Country after country was being put under bankers' dictatorship. Greece, which now has 60% unemployment for their youth, almost 30% unemployment for the population, in order to pay off their debt. How did they get so indebted, you might ask? Goldman Sachs came in and reorganized their debt, restructured their debt, so that they had to pay much more than they could afford. And in order to pay it, they had to cut everything else. Same thing happened to Italy. Italy's in tremendous chaos right now. Spain, 50% youth unemployment in Spain. Portugal just had the third largest bank in the country collapse. I just got back from Europe, and I can tell you, when you talk to bankers there, they're one step away from heading for the hills. In Austria, there's a relatively small bank that was nationalized in 2009, but instead of writing off the bad debt, the government guaranteed it. Well, it just crashed again this summer, and the government of Austria is going to have to pay 6 billion euros to keep this bank functioning. The government of Austria total budget is 70 billion euros, so almost 10% of their total budget is going to have to go to pay off one bank. And meanwhile, people who had money in that bank, who were sold life insurance policies, which they were told, this is a good thing, they do this in the US, you get a life insurance policy, there's equity, if you die, your family gets money. 250,000 people bought these life insurance policies, which were just confiscated by the bank in what's called a bail-in, which means their money's gone, just like in Cyprus. And the bank is still insolvent. So you have a collapse going on. So Ukraine looked at this, and they said, well, we have $15 billion debt due right away. What kind of deal will you give us? And the IMF said, we'll give you $1.5 billion, 10% of that. And then if you carry out structural reforms, then we'll figure out how to negotiate the rest of it. In other words, if you cut everything, cut spending, cut every aspect of your budget, we'll give you 1/10 of what you need. So they called Putin. And Putin said, we'll give you the 15 billion. We'll give you oil for half price. We know you're in trouble. We'll help you out. And so Yanukovych, being a smart politician, said, okay, Vlad, come on over, let's sign the papers. And the European Union went crazy. They said, no, you're ours. You were supposed to sign with us. And so at that point, what was unleashed was a series of demonstrations. Now, some of the demonstrators were honest, well-meaning young people. They didn't like the fact that you've had one bad government after another, and they said, let's try and get a good government in there. We want democracy. They were told, you can have democracy, the U.S. will support you. And all of a sudden, armed thugs moved in on them. Not from the Ukrainian government, but from parties opposing the Ukrainian government, called the Right Sector and the Svoboda Party, who had verifiable connections to the Nazis in the 1940s, the Ukrainians who joined with Hitler's SS troops to wipe out Hungarians, Poles, Russians, and Jews in Ukraine. Their grandchildren, they still carry the banners of a man named Stefan Bandera, who was a war criminal, who was guilty of killing people working with the Nazi SS during World War II. The EU even condemned that party in 2010. And all of a sudden that party showed up, took advantage of the unrest. There were firefights that took place. And in the middle of this was what? The US State Department. Victoria Nuland, who bragged, we bought this revolution with $5 billion. That was spent by the United States and the non-governmental organizations to build up the anti-Yanukovych regime. And under threat of being shot and killed, Yanukovych and his government fled. There was a coup, a putsch, in which this new government came in and, to top it all off, The government was headed by a guy named Yatsenyuk, who became famous when Victoria Nuland's cell phone call to the U.S. ambassador. She was Deputy Secretary of State. She called the U.S. ambassador and said, no, we're not going to let Klitschko come into the government. Remember the boxer we heard about who was the leader of the Ukrainian Revolution? Where's he? They just used the guy. He was a punch-drunk figure. He's gone. Nuland said, we're going to put in Yats because we need someone who will put in the austerity. And so the U.S. dictated who the next leader of Ukraine would be. And that's who Yatsenyuk is. Now what happened then? Yatsenyuk signed an agreement with the International Monetary Fund after Yanukovych and his government left for a 50% cut in pensions, cuts in wages, extra hours at no extra pay. Basically, the Ukrainians were suffering at that point. And they also passed laws that the people who spoke Russian were not allowed to do business in Russian anymore, because a whole part of eastern Ukraine is 60, 70, 80% Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And so it was at that point that the Crimea rose up. The Crimea is the port in the Black Sea, which used to be part of Russia. And a vote was taken, and the people there voted 90% to join Russia. Now, it's interesting, one of the issues, which was never covered in the U.S. press, was that they were going to get a 50% cut in their pensions if they stayed in Ukraine. And Putin said, well, if you're part of Russia, you'll get your whole pension. So 90% voted to stay, to go to be part of Russia. Not a shot was fired there. The shots that were fired took place in Kiev, done by the insurgency that was directed from the State Department, from the U.S. and from the British Embassy. And that's what precipitated the Ukraine crisis. And then when people in the eastern part of the country rose up and just said, we don't want to be part of a top-down control from Kiev, we want more independence, it led to what's going on now as a civil war. And part of the collateral damage of that was this MH17, the Malaysian airliner that was shot down. And nobody knows exactly who shot it down, except, of course, Obama. Obama knows it was Putin out there. You know, Putin probably was riding a Leopard with no shirt on, you know, a Buk anti-aircraft missile, and he shot it down himself. Now, what's important to realize is that for Russia, this is serious business. You have to understand something about Russia, and this is what why I'm talking about World War I today. Because there are two things that Americans don't know about. History of the rest of the world, and history about the United States. We have a country of people who don't know things that we should know because we're supposed to be a republic, and we're a superpower. And yet, our American people are so damn ignorant that they don't have any clue of why Putin is so popular in Russia. And it's not because he sometimes takes his shirt off in public. That's not why he's popular. The Russian people do know their history. They know especially their history of the recent several hundred years, when Napoleon invaded. And they, among other things, they abandoned Moscow. They let Napoleon pretty much burn it down to draw him deeper into Russia, knowing that his supply lines would be cut and the French troops would end up without supplies and would starve and freeze. They were invaded, well, they had constant wars between Russia and England. You know about the Crimean War, the famous Charge of the Light Brigade poem was written about that. But in this area here, Afghanistan, this area, that Kazakhstan and others, was known in the latter part of the 19th century as the Great Game. That was the British term for it. What was the Great Game about? Well, this was part of the British Empire. all of this area here. And the British also had claims in here. And they were afraid that the Russians would come through the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan and threaten the crown of the Indian colony, that might be lost. And so British fighting forces were deployed in Afghanistan from 1860 through 1880. Many, many Brits and many, many Russians died in Afghanistan fighting over that area. So Russia knows what it means to be surrounded. Then Hitler invaded Russia. And the Russians in World War II lost somewhere more than between 20 and 30 million people between the fighting and then the effects of the war. The Great Patriotic War. Now, you may not like Stalin, and most Russians didn't like Stalin. But when the choice was Hitler or Stalin, they rallied around Stalin and they fought the Nazis. And they were our allies in World War II. And had the Russians not fought, it would have been much worse for the Americans and the Allies when we first entered, not until 1944, Europe with the invasion at Normandy. So Russia knows this. Now, what was the Cold War? Well, as Russia expanded the Warsaw Pact into Eastern Europe, NATO put up missiles all around Russia, surrounded Russia. You had a standoff. And so after the fall of communism, where the Russians thought they would now be welcomed to the West, instead they were subjected to shock therapy under Yeltsin. And the effect of this was that the Russians made the decision they did not want to be part of the Western banking and financial system. And Yeltsin was eventually removed, Chernomyrdin was removed, he had a deal with Al Gore, and Putin came in. And Putin said, we're going to build Russia. We're going to use our natural resources, our raw materials, our skilled labor to reverse the collapse and build our nation. Now, what happened in the last 5 years after 2008, when we had the banking collapse in the West, the Western banks, in order to survive, were looking for loot from wherever they could get it. Russia has lots of dollars. You know, Russia has the 3rd or 4th largest dollar reserves in the world. China has the largest. And so they appealed to China, appealed to Russia, join the euro, buy euro bonds, become part of our system. And after considering it for a while, Putin got reelected as president. Remember, he'd been prime minister for a while. And he said no. And they said, but why not? And he said, we don't want your spoiled food. It will just give us indigestion. Referring to the bad bonds and bad debt of the Eurozone. And the Chinese likewise rejected it. And the Russians and Chinese did something very, very smart. They started building an alternative monetary system. What you've probably heard about recently, the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now, this represents, first of all, a large portion of the world's population, but also a lot of potential money and resources, but also an alternative vision of where to go with the world. While Europe and the United States is still struggling to recover economically from the crash of 2008, while Europe and the United States still have high unemployment and underemployment. You know, most of these jobs, these Obama jobs that have been created, are low-wage, part-time, and temporary. They're not living wages. People are having a hell of a time. You know this in the United States. We know it because we call you and ask you for money, and you say you don't have any. So I know all of you are broke and suffering on some level. Hopefully it's not that you're dishonest. But the American people are hurt as well. And so the bankers are looking for loot. Instead, they're being told, not only are we not going to bail you out, we're going to form a new monetary system. And that's why one thing that the American people don't know about, one among many, is that the one empire that remains in the world, the British Empire, is out to destroy Russia and China and the BRICS. In the same way, they've been destroying the United States using Obama. Now, I put up here the 4 major empires that were involved before World War I. The British Empire, which was a global empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which mainly was what was left of the Habsburgs, Austria, Hungary, Romania, some claims over the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey up to a little area in Europe, but then all of this area had been the Ottoman Empire, and then the Russian Empire. You had 3 of those empires converging in the Balkans, which is why World War I started in the Balkans. One of the reasons. But of these empires, 3 of them, or 2 of them, were wiped out in World War I, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman Empire. Russia was put through a revolution, a civil war, 70 years of domination by the communists and the Soviet Union. But it ceased to exist as an empire. But nothing stopped the British Empire except people stopped calling it an empire. The Commonwealth is 57 nations. The Queen is the sovereign of Australia and Canada. Did you know that? The Queen can dissolve the government of Canada if she wishes. And so, leading the drive against Putin was Obama, but no one trusts him anymore. He's used up. So David Cameron has personally had to come out and lead the assault, the Queen's spokesman from the Prime Minister of Britain. Now, before I get into World War I, I just want to read one more thing to you to give you a sense of how serious this crisis is. There's a man named Sergei Glaziev, who's an advisor to Putin, who's an old friend of the LaRouche movement, because he was part of the grouping in Russia that came back into power with Putin with the idea of building the Russian economy and opposing this free trade globalization plan. Glaziev was interviewed by Bloomberg News Service 2 days ago. Oh, I'm sorry, a month ago. The headline was, "World War on Russia's Mind when U.S. Duels over Ukraine." So when we say World War III and nuclear war is imminent, this is now in the press. This was a July 8th article. And Glaziev said to Bloomberg, he was asked what they're doing with their economy. He said, task number 1 is to block those threats to economic security that are now coming from the United States. Neutralize them by reducing the dependence of our external economic activity on the mercy of American politicians, whose aggressiveness threatens the entire world. He's talking about the sanctions that were taking money and trying to drain the Russian banks, prevent them from getting credit, and stop trade. And he said, what could serve as our chief response is the implementation of a plan for fast-track development of the Russian economy on the basis of a new technological order. This plan includes a transition to a sovereign monetary system, underpinned by internal sources of credit, an active policy of innovation and support for progress in science and technology. Does that sound a little familiar to some of you? It sounds like LaRouche's policy, the LaRouche Four Basic Laws, doesn't it? That's what Glaziev represents. The Alexander Hamilton American system. This is what Russia and China and Brazil are doing. And at the end of his interview, he said, the point of a series of regional wars organized by the Americans, especially today's catastrophe in Ukraine, centers on the U.S. securing control over all of North Eurasia to bolster its position against China. So the Russians are very serious about this threat. Now, what does this have to do with World War I? You know, the question's always asked. When you read what happened in World War I, you know, then it wasn't about missiles and bombers and things of that sort. You had to mobilize armies. It took a week or 2 weeks or a month to mobilize an army. You had to call them up. You couldn't tweet them. You know, you had to go to villages in southern France, in Siberia. You had to call in troops. You had to get the horses ready. You had to get the munitions ready. Now, there had been a buildup in all these countries, but the question is often asked, why was it that the assassination of the Austrian Archduke, that is the next emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Ferdinand, who was murdered in Serbia on I think it was the 29th of June in 1914. Why did that lead to a world war? And that's why you have to understand the question of empires, and especially the British Empire. So let's go back to an important date, 1876, where the United States threw a big birthday party. It was called the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. And people from all over the world came to this. And we had inventors and scientists. We had Edison. We had the rail system. People came to see what's going on in the United States. And they were astounded by the advances made in technology, the innovations, the steam engines, the ability to produce steel, and the extent to which the United States was emerging as a real country. And in the meantime, what did you have in Europe? You still had, Germany had just been unified by Bismarck, but was still not really a real nation. Italy was unified, but was quite weak. France had just been destroyed in the Franco-Prussian War by the Germans for the Prussians. And the British were going through a bit of a downturn. You'd had a global economic crisis in 1875-76, and yet the United States appeared strong. So what did they do? They found out what was it that the Americans knew that they didn't know. And they discovered an economist named Henry Carey, who had been Lincoln's chief economist, who was one of the leading advocates of the greenback policy, which was a sovereign currency policy that allowed the North to build its economy so they could win the Civil War. And Carey's ideas were for a national bank, a national sovereign credit policy, a tariff policy to protect industry, and internal improvements. That was Hamilton's program. That's how our nation was built. And Lincoln brought us back to that. Now, the Civil War, just so you know, and I'm not going to detail all these things, but the Civil War was the third British war against America. You had the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and they tried one more time with the Confederacy. And each time, the American Constitutional Republic won. And as the United States blossomed, even after the assassination of Lincoln, which was done by the British, even as the United States blossomed, Europe paid attention and said they wanted to learn from this. And the first country that took off was Germany. Bismarck introduced his American system reforms. They put in a tariff to stop cheap British steel from destroying the German steel industry and cheap Russian grain from destroying the Prussian farmers. They had a credit system. They had built up rail. They built up the coal and the steel sector. And all of a sudden, Germany was building more rapidly, growing more rapidly than Britain, which was considered the great world power. France then took up the same idea. Italy, Russia under Sergei Witte, Japan. The American system took over the whole world. And in country after country that implemented it, they grew. Their economy grew and strengthened. While the British system, which still dominated world trade, was in trouble. Now, the British system was essentially based on control of trade by ships, by seagoing vessels, the deep blue oceanic power. And they did it through free trade by dumping cheap goods and destroying advanced countries, and essentially by having slave colonies around the world to get cheap raw materials. Now, what threatened this? The British were very concerned when they saw the development of steel industries in Germany, And some people say, well, that's because Germany could now build weapons as good as the British. You know, quite frankly, the Germans had better weapons than the British for a long time. That wasn't the issue. The issue of national development is the question of wealth production based on the advances in the creativity of the population. That's how you increase productivity. If you take a peasant and try and put them in a munitions factory, it doesn't work. You have to upgrade their quality of education and understanding of the world. And the Germans, with the Humboldt education system, had science, language, culture, the classical musical culture, the poetry. And so their population could assimilate these new technologies very quickly. Similar, that's what happened in America, especially with waves of immigrants. You know, the parents would come over, they couldn't speak the language, and by the time their children were grown up, they were in college and getting educations and advancing and growing. So the British was based on this, the British system, British imperial system, cheap labor, cheap raw materials, free trade, deregulation. And what really triggered the break was the decision to build a high-speed rail, or for the time, a rail, that would connect Western Europe with Russia to the Pacific, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And then secondly, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad. That would have threatened, again, the British view is it would have threatened their colonies. And so it was at that point that the British realized they had to break up the potential for these alliances based on economic development. And just very briefly, you know, Bismarck tried to form an alliance that he thought would be strong enough, what became known as the Drei-Kaiser-Bund, the Three Kaiser League, which was an alliance of Germany, Russia, and Austro-Hungary, which is now Austria, basically. The British constantly were breaking this up. Britain and France in this period, 1870 to 1903, were constantly almost at war in Africa, in North Africa, Morocco. And finally what happened is, as France was humiliated, the British moved in and said, all right, let's become friends. And in 1904 they signed an agreement called the Entente Cordiale. So now Britain had France on their side. Now, part of this was based on the British moving into Egypt in 1882. They basically foreclosed the Suez Canal, which the French had built. The British took it over. They moved in a whole team of Arabists, people who had studied Arab language and Arab culture, into Egypt. And the British were trying to figure out how to break the Turkish control over this whole area. This was all part of Turkey. Egypt had been also, but the British took it over. Now, the other question then was what would happen between Germany and Russia? Because Germany was helping to finance Russian industrialization. And so in 1904, funded by the British, Japan attacked Russia. You had the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. And Japan, which had built up its industry much quicker than Russia, crushed the Russians. And as the Russian military lost the war, there was a revolution in the streets funded by the British that almost overthrew the Tsar in 1905. And so Russia, in a weakened condition, came to the British. And in 1907, they signed a treaty with the British. Now, one part of the treaty, just to give you a sense of how these empires worked, they divided what's today Iran, which was then called Persia, in three. The northern part was Russian territory, the southern part was British, and the middle part was neutral, which meant British. So here you have the British making deals with the Russians of this sort. Now, so just to summarize this quickly, you had these empires breaking apart, collapsing. There's nationalist uprisings. You had all kinds of things going. But behind all of this, you had the British manipulating France, manipulating Russia, eventually forming the Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, and Russia. So when the events occurred in Sarajevo of the assassination of the Archduke, and the Austrians gave an ultimatum to the Serbs, the Russians mobilized to defend the Serbs. The Germans mobilized to defend the Austrians. The Triple Entente Treaty Agreement came into effect. That is, that the French and the British were going to defend their Russian ally. And so, as the days marched through July 1914 into August, by August 4th, war was declared. And everybody thought this will be a quick war. There'll be some shooting, maybe some land will be taken, maybe Alsace-Lorraine will be taken back by the French, maybe it'll stay in German hands. But everyone thought it would be a quick, glorious war. And yet it went on for 4 years with millions dead. And some of the battles are just incredible. For 6 months in the River Marne, within about a 1 square mile of area, over 4 million people died, charging up a hill and being knocked back. I think it was 160,000 Australians and New Zealanders were killed based on the idiocy of Churchill when they decided to go after Turkey by going up this little peninsula here, which is made famous by the tip of the peninsula is called Gallipoli. And it's this little beach and then a mountain. And the Turkish guns were on the top of the mountain. And the British sent the Aussies and the New Zealanders day after day to the beach to get slaughtered. Every day the water turned red with blood of the soldiers. And Churchill kept saying, "Try it again, boys." So there was a slaughter. Of course, it was Aussies and New Zealanders. But the British lost a lot. But what happened at the end of the war? Well, the whole time during the war, the British were preparing for the end game. And the key was, there were 2 keys to it. One was the Treaty of Versailles, which punished Germany and laid the basis for the Hitler takeover within a decade, a little more than a decade after the agreement. But secondly, was the British move into this area called the Middle East. That included the most famous person who probably all of you have heard of is Lawrence, Colonel T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. But he was just one actor in a drama which included the Balfour Declaration of 1917 promising a Jewish homeland, when there were something like only 60,000 Jews in Palestine and 600,000 Palestinian Muslims and Christians. And they said that land would become a Jewish state. That was the promise made. Because that would mean there would always be a crisis there and the British would be involved. They took the family that since the time of the Prophet Muhammad had been the guardian of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, Sharif Hussein's family. That's who Lawrence, see, the British said, we're going to support an Arab revolt, an Arab nation against the Turks. And so while Lawrence of Arabia was marching with Faisal and Abdullah Hussein, St. John Philby was embedded into the troops of King Saud, or who at the time was just Ibn Saud. And the British used the Hussein forces to drive the Turks out, but then came to them and said, well, sorry fellas, but you can't keep Mecca and Medina anymore. We're giving it to the Sauds. And the Saud tribesmen came in and slaughtered the forces of the Hussein family, who were moved where? You know, King Hussein of Jordan. You probably remember the name. That's what happened. His family was given Jordan with a promise they could keep some of Jerusalem. And Faisal Hussein, who was the key fighter with Lawrence of Arabia, was made king of Iraq until he was overthrown. And while all this was going on, there were secret meetings between the British and the French. to draw up the borders of the post-war Middle East, something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which said that France could have domination over Lebanon and Syria, that Iraq, Kuwait, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, which at the time was just called Arabia, would be under the protection of the British. They had different kinds of deals on Iran, namely who would be able to control the Shah. And that's the problem we have in the Middle East today. You had arbitrary nations set up with different tribes, different religious groups. And in some cases, they tried to make these nations work. For example, Iraq. You know, Saddam Hussein was not the greatest guy, but he actually made Iraq function by keeping the Sunnis and the Shias from killing each other, by using oil revenue to build universities and medical care and highways and water projects, by promoting women. You know, you look at Saddam Hussein, who was vilified by Bush Sr., then again by Clinton, then by Bush Jr. And yet we're allied with the Saudis, who don't even allow their wives to drive cars, where women have no rights in Saudi Arabia. So this idea that all of this is about democracy and freedom, it's not. It's about empire, and the one empire that still exists is the British. Now, it's not a territorial empire. It's an empire on two levels: financial, corporate, and what's called by some an empire of the mind. If you can keep people ignorant of who's oppressing them, then you can control them. And so what do most Americans think? You know, they think Obama's the big bad guy, or Bush is the big bad guy, or Cheney's the big bad guy. They don't like bankers. But what do we do about it? And so we have this imperial force that organized World War I, that organized the slaughter of millions, that organized the phony peace after World War I that created the basis for the rise of Hitler. And after World War II, Churchill organized to divide the world again between two empires, a Soviet empire and a US military-backed, British-dominated, Western European transatlantic empire. And we had presidents who opposed it. Franklin Roosevelt was opposed to it. But he died, and Truman was willing to go along with Churchill. In fact, he was controlled by Churchill. John Kennedy opposed that empire, and he was killed. And since Kennedy, we've had a series of presidents who are, at best, mediocre. Most of them are just downright evil, puppets of this empire. And what's been the economic policy? You know, today, just for those who don't know, is a famous day. This is the day 40 years ago that Richard Nixon went on television and resigned. And I did an interview with a lawyer who was part of the White House team with Nixon, a man named Douglas Caddy. And we were talking in the interview about what happened in 1974, and he said, well, you know what, at least the system worked. Republicans went to Nixon and said, you've got to go. And Nixon was doing things that were illegal, like a secret war in Cambodia, which led to an explosion on the campuses when it became public. He was doing FBI black bag jobs, where they were incriminating people and putting things in your resumes that made it so you could never get jobs. They had an enemies list. They did all those things privately. Today we have presidents who do that in the open. Since 9/11, you've lost your rights and your freedoms. With the NSA spying, with the president claiming the right to kill you with a drone without due process. You know that? That's part of our law now. Regime change. We do it in the open. We no longer carry out covert assassinations. We go in and destroy nations. Look at Libya. You know, Gaddafi wasn't a great guy. What did we leave the Libyan people? A permanent civil war with Islamic jihadist militias terrorizing the country. Look at this group ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic Caliphate. You're slaughtering people. And we supposedly are going to bomb them now. Well, with one arm we're bombing them, with another arm we're giving them money. Because we're trying to get rid of Assad, who's the only leader in the Middle East who's really fighting terrorists. This is the British Empire. We have a president who's run by the Queen of England and by the financial and other networks, corporate networks, that are centered in the City of London. And that's a financial network that's collapsing. That's what we see in Europe, that's what we see in the United States. We have a bubble, a financial bubble right now. You think it's a recovery? How long are you going to live on your stocks? Remember how many people thought they were going to make it and be rich because their houses were going up and up and up in value, and then all of a sudden, boom, nothing. Remember people thought their stock portfolios were going up and up and up and up, and all of a sudden they collapsed. What do you think's happening now? Stocks and companies that don't produce anything are going through the roof. Why would Twitter be worth $2 billion? What the hell does Twitter make? What do they sell? What do they do? Yahoo, I mean, thank God for the Chinese. They're kicking Google and Yahoo out of the country. You know, we're spying on the Chancellor of Germany. The NSA has bugged her cell phone. Well, you want to find out when she's going home late for dinner? Try and stir up some marital discord or something? And the Israelis, they were bugging John Kerry's phone. So when Kerry would say, all right, we're going to go in and we're really going to tell Netanyahu this, this, and this, Netanyahu would be sitting there with the talking points all ready to go. You know, this is the control of the world by a small group of people from these interlocking financial and corporate interests who control the main governments in the world and are trying to destroy any opposition. Now, the opposition is coming from China, from Russia, from Brazil, from India, from South Africa, countries like Argentina, Guatemala, Thailand. But the opposition should be led to this system by the United States. Because we were created as an anti-imperial republic. That's still our tradition. And so the way you avoid a World War I or a World War II or World War III is you go after the enemy. The invisible enemy in some cases. Now Obama is the front man for them. You get Obama out of there, and you go with Glass-Steagall to take the power away from the big banks, and all of a sudden the British Empire collapses. Like a house of cards. And then we can, as the real America, work with China and Russia. And China is doing phenomenal things. I'm not going to go through it now, but you can go on our website and see what they're doing with helium-3. They're preparing for a fusion economy. We were doing this in the 1950s before it was shut down. So the Chinese have said they would like the United States to join with them. The Chinese are going into Africa, the poorest countries in Africa. They're building bridges, dams, canals, roads. What are we doing? We're going in and giving them lectures about self-sufficiency. You know, President Obama was asked by an African student the other day, what can we do to overcome the legacy of colonialism? And Obama basically said, suck it up, buddy, and start doing some work. That's not the American response. Because we were the nation that showed that colonialism is finished with our revolution. And the great tragedy is that we've lost that. That's why I say not knowing history is the key to being enslaved. Not that you're doomed to repeat it, but that you're doomed to not have a clue of what you need to do to get into the future. Because history is not really about the past, it's about the future. How do we take civilizations the best of civilizations, the best of science, the best of culture, and use these ideas to create new civilizations that exist on a higher level. That's the nature of the history of man. So that's why we have to know what happened in World War I. And of course, this is a very, very abridged presentation. But essentially, it was the period where you had empires that were collapsing, converging, being manipulated against each other by the British. And we in the United States were brought into this war on behalf of the British, World War I. And today the British are trying to do the same thing, use the United States to destroy Russia and China. And here's the final point I'll make, and then I'll take some questions. Why is this so important? I mean, why are we saying we face nuclear war? Well, I read you what Glaziev said. What Lyndon LaRouche said is that the Russians are very quietly preparing for war. They're not being provoked, but they see what's being done with the idea of a 25,000 NATO rapid deployment force that could be put into Eastern Europe. U.S. military equipment put into Latvia and Estonia. Poland being built up as a military force against Russia. The Asian theater, the tilt against China. Japan talking about rearming, even though in their constitution it's forbidden. So the Russians see this and they're preparing for war. And some people say, well, don't they know nuclear war would be bad? Well, you don't understand something about empires. If an empire is threatened, it will go into a war even if it's a war of extinction. The first head of state who actually put this down in writing, not in writing, but said it, was Louis XIV of France, who was asked, all these wars, where's this going to get you? And he said, who cares? Après nous le déluge. After us, it's all gone. It's George W. Bush's philosophy. He was asked, what is history going to think about you? And he said, what do I care? I'll be dead. This is how empires work. If these empires went to war and disappeared, the Romanov dynasty in power from 1613 disappeared in a flash in 1917. 300 years of Romanovs. The last ones were taken out and shot and killed. So empires die. The one empire that hasn't died is the one we have to put to death. The British Empire. We get rid of that one, we got a chance at saving civilization. If we don't get rid of them, starting with their puppet running the United States, Obama, we're going to end up in World War III, sooner rather than later. So if you have some questions, I will be happy to answer them. Yeah.
All right. I think we need to really put on the minds of our soldiers and the military that their alliance is not to the United States President, but to the United States people. And the President does not lead the Army against the people.
Well, you know, this is an interesting point because, did everyone hear what he said? That, you know, what we have now is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff have so far been resisting the more outrageous actions that Obama's been taking. The problem is that if Obama tells them to fight Russia, we don't know what they're going to do. Now, we do know that General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is in regular contact with General Gerasimov, the head of the Russian military. There are all sorts of contacts. Excuse me. But that's what's been cut off by the sanctions. Gerasimov can't come to the United States now to meet with Dempsey. So Obama's trying to cut this off. Now, look, the military, here's the problem in the United States. The military doesn't have a history of making coups. And you really wouldn't want military coups in the United States. This is what the people have to do. You know, if the people take charge, the military would be very happy to see Obama go. But it's our job to do it. And here's where you get to the real problem. The Americans who don't know most of this history don't want to take responsibility for the future. Look, you know this. You talk to people and you go through Obama's no good. He's got to go, yeah, that guy's no good. He's a bum. He's a piece of crap. Get him out of there. All right, well, will you call your congressman and tell him that? Oh, it won't do any good. I'm not going to call my congressman. Or someone says, oh, I do that all the time. Well, I say, who's your congressman? Really, that's the American people. Here I'm on my congressman's ass all the time. Well, who's your congressman? I don't know. So, you see, the problem is not the military. The military has been relatively good in this. It's the people that suck. It's the American people who keep voting for congressmen who are idiots and corrupt and immoral. Or congressmen who are decent people but get corrupted. Or the congressmen give up. And so it's our responsibility to change that. Now, hopefully, the military would not accept an order to launch a nuclear war. But I wouldn't bet on it. And that's why we have to do our job. Don, you have a question.
What's the chance of these Nazi gangs that, you know, because this was told that that's what's actually in Ukraine, it's not a new government.
Yeah.
But what's the chance of they're like going west, you know, once they're kind of established there, you know?
Well, they're very weak. The only reason they were put in power was to provoke Russia. Because you see, the Russians know their history. They know that when people are marching in Maidan Square behind a banner of Stepan Bandera, that Bandera was out to kill Russians in the 1940s. See, when Ukraine got taken over by Hitler, they got 70,000 Ukrainians to join on some level with the pro-German militia. But there was a core of about 15 to 20,000 that became killers with the SS. And that was the Bandera group. Now, these parties that are in the government in Ukraine support that they're admirers of Bandera. They say they're the heirs of Bandera. So what does that mean for the Russians? You put these guys in power knowing that they killed tens of thousands of Russians. And then you ask us to accept their control over the Russian ethnic populations in eastern Ukraine? I mean, Putin would have been justified, to tell you the truth, he would have been justified to go into eastern Ukraine and say to the Kiev government, if you fire any more at these people, we're going to blow you up. But he hasn't done it because he knows that's a trap. That would just be a pretext for a launch from the West. So the Russians are stuck right now. They're trying to do everything they can diplomatically, but they're dealing with liars who have no power. And Obama calls Putin. They talk for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then Obama gets out off the phone and says, well, how can you work with Putin? He shot down the Malaysian flight. And he's asked, where's your evidence? And he says, oh, everyone knows. One of the State Department briefers, when she was challenged by the press, just said, who are you going to believe, them or us? So, the problem, Don, is that they weren't put in power to move to the West, or they don't even have the power. Here they are, they're cutting their budgets, but they're increasing the taxes so they can afford their military in Ukraine. They're just there to provoke the Russians. So now, what gets out of control is not the situation in Ukraine, but the bigger picture. That's where the like World War I, that's the miscalculation. Oh, the Russians will never launch a nuclear strike. Well, if they think they're in danger of being nuked first, they will launch a nuclear strike. Because they know that planners in the West think we can win a nuclear war. And they're using the example of the so-called Iron Dome in Israel. Because all these Hamas rockets are getting knocked out of the sky. But I got news for you, these Hamas rockets are not Russian ICBMs.
Not quite.
And we do not have an anti-ballistic missile system that can protect us from thermonuclear strikes. Yeah.
It does say in the Bible, in the book of Hosea, that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And in the book of Isaiah, it says, where there is no vision,
People
my
perish.
people perish.
Yeah.
And I will tell you that from what I can see, all I know what I see right now is that this group, the LaRouche PAC, is the only major group that I know of that has any vision today. The conservative movement, as far as I'm concerned, I was part of it for decades.
Mhm.
They never had it. The left, I go out and demonstrate with them against these wars, but when you talk to them, break them down, they don't really have a clue what's going on. When you talk to them one by one, and you're able to use certain vocabulary, sometimes you can bring them around to see what we're trying to push with the technological advances and all these things. And you can come to some sort of agreement. But I'm telling you, it just, if you talk to people on a more long-term basis, they do come around and see what it is that we're about and what we're trying to advance.
Well, see, this is really the key, and this is where Lyndon LaRouche is not just a visionary or a forecaster. I mean, what Lynn always says is, why do you do forecasts? What's the point of forecasting? To show people how smart you are? To try and make money in the stock market? No, it's to come up with alternatives. Because if you can see the direction where the policy is taking you, then you can come up with alternatives. And right now there's one alternative to this, and that's the alliance of the United States with the BRICS nations and going with these new technologies, high-speed rail, but most importantly, nuclear fusion. And, you know, Obama's mocking China. He's mocking their space program. Now, the important thing that I was going to get to in what you said is, look, we're a small organization, but we have big ideas. And there are people listening, like Sergei Glaziev, Putin's one of his chief advisors, is very familiar with LaRouche's concept of productivity and value. There's a whole grouping in the Russian Academy. There was a man named Pobits Kuznetsov, who was a leading scientist in Russia. He was jailed several times under the communist regime. He was a patriot scientist, and after the fall of communism, he got to know LaRouche. He invited LaRouche to Moscow. They got to be friends, and then unfortunately he passed away a few years ago. But he actually proposed that the unit of value that measures value in an economy should be called the law after LaRouche. And what he said is that the issue that LaRouche takes up, as opposed to a speculative economy or an imperial economy with cheap labor, cheap raw materials, the measure of success of an economy is in two measurements. Potential relative population density. How many people can be sustained at an improving living standard in a certain square kilometer area? And secondly, energy flux density. What is the power you can bring to your productive process to increase the overall productivity? You can't do it with windmills and solar, but we see through history with the move from coal to oil and gas to nuclear fission and to fusion. You increase the power of each worker to produce more than is consumed. That's how you measure value, not monetary terms. So a key grouping of the Russian intelligentsia wants to use that and establish that as a measure and name it after LaRouche. So our small organization is at the center of a scientific and technological revolution in Russia. In China, people in China who study Lin and his ideas are very much incorporating that into their perspective of how to fight colonialism. Now, the problem we have in the United States is Americans are stupid but also very arrogant. You know, we think we're number one. You know, I mean, the fact that we have the lowest scores in science for kids. It doesn't matter because we have the most money. We have the most billionaires in the world. You know, we measure things wrong. We make money a god. Now, one good ally we have on this is Pope Francis, who just said, money is not God. And so we've got to go out and really evangelize, recruit people to understand what the American Revolution was and how we can apply those ideas today. So that we may be small, but our ideas are powerful. And we can talk to conservatives, to liberals, to most people. Now, some people,
labels anyway, right?
yeah. Well, you know, the problem is that the majority of the population wants Obama out. But the majority of the population thinks it'll never happen.
That's a big problem. Right
So what do you have to do? Give them more reasons to get Obama out? No, you have to say to them, why are you so gutless? Why are you accepting the destruction of our nation? Why are you accepting the collapse of a country that you're raising your children and grandchildren in? When did Americans become so ballless? We've got, look, do that with a conservative and they really freak out, but it's true. You know, when I talk to conservatives and say, oh, I'm a good conservative, I say, all you're doing is conserving Barack Obama's presidency. I wouldn't brag about it. And, you know, progressives who say, well, I care about the people. Well, then get that bum out of there. Why are you afraid to say something bad about him? Because he's African American? Because he's black, you're afraid your friends will think he's a racist? Didn't white people attack Bush? I'm white, I attack Bush. Was I supposed to support Bush because he's allegedly white? You know, this idea that this is how people are made stupid. I talk to African Americans all the time who say, oh, Obama, he's terrible, he's killing us. Well, you know, come out and do something. Well, you know, I got to give the brother a chance. Actually, my favorite is the talk show host in Columbus, who, when you start talking about the first black president, he says, no, man, it's the white side of him that's doing this. So people are scared. You know, Lynn addressed this last night in the webcast. I'd urge all of you to look at the webcast last night on our website. And what did Lynn say? He said, people are afraid. What are you afraid of? You afraid you might get shot? You might get killed? Well, I got news for you. You're going to die at some point. The question is, are you going to live for anything? Are you going to stand for anything while you're alive? Or are you going to be a slave to popular opinion? So this is what we have to do. We have to get under the skin of people to get them to act. You had a question.
Yeah, this with regard to a diplomatic role. Do you think that Putin did the right thing to provide asylum for Schneider under the circumstances of Ukraine crisis? Whether he is gripping the power over a period of more than 2 decades, and what is the motive for it? The second question.
Wait, now, who is it you were asking about?
Putin and Snowden.
Okay, Snowden, yeah.
Second question, what would be the impact if thermonuclear war takes place between USA and Russia?
Well, the answer to that is very simple. There won't be much left on the planet. If you look at the amount of power that exists, destructive power in nuclear weapons, and the total volume, you know, the point is, if a nuclear war starts, what are we going to do? Say, okay, you can blow up one of our cities, we'll blow up one of yours, and we can negotiate? That's not the way war works. So once you unleash nuclear war, it's very unlikely that there'll be a lot of people left on the planet. And one of the things that was said is that the survivors will envy the dead. So we've got to stop it. We can't let it happen. Now, interestingly, on the Snowden question, the Russians just granted him another 3 years asylum. And what I think is interesting is there are now reports that there may be 2 or 3 other people doing what Snowden did, who are still in the system somewhere. Now, Snowden is an example of what one person can do. You know, he's one person who risked everything. And you know, he had no guarantee he was going to make it to a place where he could get asylum. But he risked his career, his family, his own life, because he couldn't live with the idea that this kind of spy operation was set up. Now, Snowden should be given the Nobel Peace Prize. He should be given allowed to come back here as a hero. But the people in our country in power are saying he's a criminal. And then you get people who are saying Netanyahu should get the Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah.
Snowden should take the Nobel Peace Prize from Obama.
Well, the fact that Obama got a Nobel Peace Prize is a reason that no one should want one. Any more questions?
Here.
Yeah.
I have a point to make and a question.
Okay.
Well, besides Obama, of course, if you look back to the history of the United States has always sided with the empire in all wars, the first and the second and anything in between. So looks like it's a long-lasting, problem with American culture. It's not just Obama.
Well, look, there's actually an interesting point to this, which is that we were opposed to the empire when we created it. We fought a revolution to get away from it. We fought them again in 1812. And the British continued to try and subvert the United States, including defending the Confederacy. And we beat them again. Now, the problem was after we beat them in 1865, Lincoln was killed. And we had a series of presidents. Grant was not so terrible, but then we had a series of presidents who were more interested in making money. And we had a good president come back in McKinley, and he was killed. McKinley was against the British, totally against the British. And he was killed, and Teddy Roosevelt came in, who was pro-British. Wilson was a catastrophe. He was totally committed to the British Empire. And then Coolidge and Hoover. But Franklin Roosevelt was not so much fighting for the British as he was to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese and then end colonialism after the war. And if you read we actually did a very good documentary called 1932, which goes through the quotes from Roosevelt to Churchill, because Roosevelt said to Churchill in these meetings, "Never again will Americans die for the British Empire." He knew that it was the Brits who had a role in putting Hitler in power, along with people like the Bush family and the Harriman family. And FDR was moving to destroy the British Empire after the war, and he died. And Truman was a nobody. He was a complete puppet. And Churchill came and basically wrapped him around his finger. Now, Eisenhower was, just in a couple of cases, was very different. More of a Roosevelt type. He ended the Korean War. Eisenhower did. And then when the Israelis invaded Egypt in the Sinai crisis and the Suez crisis in 1956, with the British and French support, Eisenhower threatened London. He told the Israelis, "You go back," and he said to the British, "You will not support this." And Kennedy was moving against the whole British Empire. He was against the war in Vietnam. And that's probably why he was killed. Now, since Kennedy's death, they say Lyndon Johnson himself said it, that the whole time he was president, he felt a target on the back of his head. Nixon was a paranoid guy who could be easily manipulated. Jimmy Carter was completely controlled by the Wall Street Trilateral Commission grouping. Reagan had a little independence, but not so much on foreign policy. He was very much influenced by Thatcher. Bush Sr. was a total British puppet. Clinton was constantly battling back and forth, but they used the impeachment in the end to get him to go along with the empire. And then Bush and Obama, are just total British agents. So we actually have a history in our best moments of being anti-imperial. Our Constitution is anti-imperial. It is for the right of the sovereign citizen and the sovereign nation state. Our good presidents like John Quincy Adams and Lincoln understood that. But people don't know that anymore. We think, oh, the alliance of the English-speaking peoples. You know, we've been brainwashed by the BBC, by Churchill, by American presidents. You know, Obama fawns over the Queen of England in this wrinkled old prune face. You know, Obama is, oh, it's so great to see the Queen. You know, this is the loss of our Republican tradition. So, and look, what do most Americans think? Most Americans believe in individual freedom. We don't believe in being subjects, the way the British are. Excuse me. But we've lost some of that spunk because we don't know. We don't know the history. And part of our job is to teach this history to people. It's a really important point we have to make. Yeah.
A question again concerning both wars, first and second. After World War I, there was a Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
In which I guess they decided that Germany would not have a strong military. As a matter of fact, they tore apart all the airplanes and all that. And they weren't supposed to have any battle sheets and all that. My question is that how could Hitler build up all that military power under the watchful eyes of the Brits right across from the water?
Because the Brits wanted him to. Look, what happened, the Versailles Treaty, the other thing was the reparations payments and the decision that Germany was the cause of the war. See, all the history books said it was the Germans that caused World War I. The history I just went through about the British, none of that's there. You have to really read carefully to see it. They blamed Germany, they penalized them, they created a collapse in 1922-23 that led to the Weimar hyperinflation, chaos, unemployment, and eventually Hitler was funded by American and British bankers and put in power. Of course they let him build up the country again, because they wanted Hitler to go east against the Soviet Union. They wanted Germany and Russia to destroy each other.
So at what point Hitler decides that, you know, he's like genie out of the bottle, turns his guns
Well, Hitler was, that's the way Hitler was. I mean, he wasn't that easy a puppet to control, and at a certain point he told his generals, we're going west. And they had the Hitler-Stalin pact. Look, this is an interesting example. Stalin made an agreement not to have a war with Hitler. And then what did he do? He built up for a war because he knew it was inevitable. Meanwhile, Hitler was moving west. And that's when Churchill came running to the United States and said, please, please bail us out. And FDR said, we'll do this one more time, but this is the last time. You know, one of the things FDR did is he had his Attorney General seize the bank, the Union Bank Company of New York, which was run by the Harriman and Bush family, which had been funding the Nazis. So FDR knew this was going on, that you had these bad networks in the United States that were supporting it, and Britain that were supporting Hitler. But was there, yeah.
It seems like with what Obama just did with the airstrikes, like there's humanitarian stuff too, but it seems like he's really spitting in the face of Congress, and I don't, you know, that's just my perception. I mean, that resolution passed 370 to something like that.
Yeah, the HCR 105.
Yeah. So, you know, my perception is he's spitting in their face, and, you know, I talked to the congresswoman that supported it, sponsored it. And I'm expecting, you know, much more reaction, particularly from the Republicans. Is it just not coming yet, or?
No, you see, these guys are not stupid. I mean, they didn't maintain their power by being stupid. Look, in this case, what are you going to do? Argue that we should have let the jihadist terrorists slaughter 30,000 Christians?
Yeah.
Or threaten American lives in Erbil? So this is how Obama is playing it. And it does say, even in HCR 105, if American lives are threatened, he can act, because that's part of the War Powers Agreement. That there are immediately American lives at stake, and what he's saying is that we could face another Benghazi and Erbil. That's what Obama was saying today. So this is one of these exceptions that he's using that he thinks he can get away with. Now the point is, that's why you can't get trapped into looking at these things narrowly. What's the issue here? That we shouldn't protect Christians who are isolated on a hilltop from being slaughtered? No, the issue is the people we're fighting right now, we're bombing right now, we created. We destroyed Iraq. We undermined Syria so that these forces could grow and become a real army. We armed them. We trained them. He should be thrown out of office for that. And if you did that, then you would change the situation in the Middle East. Because you have a potential with an alliance of Assad and Iran and several other governments, including Iraq, that might be able to deal with some of these terrorist forces on their own. But if we're mucking around in there and getting the Turks to arm them and the Saudis to arm them, you know, if we wanted to stop a crisis in the Middle East, you get rid of Obama, and then you bring the Saudis up for charges on 9/11. And you bring the Saudis up for charges for arming the jihadists. And then you start to change the geometry. That's how you do it. So we shouldn't react simply. I mean, what Lynn is saying is, look, we know that what Obama is doing is wrong. It is a violation. But we've got to get it for the right reason. Yeah.
Why don't we evacuate our people out of that situation?
Well, that's what we should do.
Yeah.
That's what we should do. We should move our people out instead of putting 800 people in. Once you get a few boots on the ground and you start having a couple people killed, the military is going to say, look, you can't leave us hanging in there. Either get us out or give us more troops. One of the generals in charge of this said, look, ISIS is an army. You're not going to stop them without an army. So they're preparing the ground for going in for that kind of war. Take one last question. Yeah.
I'm going to repeat something that I commented last week, and I feel very strongly about this. If we're going to remove Obama, I believe that the way to do it is through the Democratic Party.
Absolutely.
Because the Republicans, who's going to do it? Cruz? He says, Obama, get tough on Russia. Rand Paul can't make up his mind whether he's for or against Israel. He doesn't even know what the left and the right in his own brain is doing. Elizabeth Warren, I would trust a lot more than any of those guys. But Keisha Rogers spoke with 3 or 4 Democratic legislators when she was in D.C.
Yeah.
These are the kind of people that I think that we could.
Well, she spoke to a lot more than that. Look, the point you're making, let's take the example of 40 years ago. On August 7th, 1974, Barry Goldwater, Republican Senator Hugh Scott, who's the minority leader in the Senate, and John Rhodes, the congressman from Arizona, who's the Republican leader in the House, went in to see Nixon. And Nixon said, how's it look, boys? And they said, it looks pretty bad. You better skedaddle. And Nixon said, well, how many senators will still support me? And Goldwater said maybe 12 to 15, and Scott said 10 at most. They went to deliver the message. You got to leave. And they said it's for the country. Now, can you imagine Democrats going in and doing that with Obama? Well, actually, maybe yes. So, Mark Udall, for example, who's the senator from Colorado, who's facing a tough re-election campaign. He's already told Obama not to come in there. When Obama went in there, Obama went in to do a fundraiser for him, and he didn't go to it. Because he knows Obama's the kiss of death. But he's fighting Obama on the NSA and on drones. You've got this woman, Natalie Tennant, who's running for the Senate in West Virginia. She's a Democrat. And she just did an ad where she said, President Obama, keep your hands off West Virginia's coal, or we're going to send you a message. And then they show her pulling down the power switch and the lights going off at the White House. That's a Democrat.
That's a very anti-Obama state.
Well, then you have Shaheen in New Hampshire, who's not too happy with things. You have, but you know, we're going to have to force it, because the Democrats are basically saying the Tea Party's so terrible, so we can't let them come in. Well, here's the problem. The way you're going to get them in is if you keep Obama in there, because people are reacting against Obama. Now then, on the Republican side, it's even worse. What are the Republicans saying? They're saying, well, we could never get him out because the Senate's controlled by the Democrats. Number one. Then number two, they say, this is a Democratic issue now because Obama's saying that they're going to try to impeach him so he can raise money and rally the base. Now here's my reaction to that. You stupid idiots. You just, this congressman in Texas the other day went through a 20-minute rant about all the impeachable things Obama did. Then one of our guys said, so are you going to impeach him? He said, oh no, it will never pass the Senate, and the Democrats will use it against us.
Stockman?
No, someone dumber than Stockman. Farenthold. Now here's the point. Had I been there, I would have said, listen, you idiot. Present the case to the American people. You really think Democratic senators are going to stand up and defend this guy when it becomes clear that he's responsible for the deaths in Benghazi, when he's responsible for the chaos in Iraq, when he's putting us on the verge of thermonuclear war with Russia? You think the Democrats in the Senate are going to defend him? But what are the Republicans upset about? Immigration. The Republicans, it was often said about the Palestinians, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The Republicans are even worse. You've got the worst president in history, no popularity, no support, destroying the country, and they're saying we're going to use this to elect more Republicans. So, in other words, the worse the country goes, the more they think they'll make electoral gains. You want to trust the country to people like that?
No.
So we've got to move both parties. It's got to be bipartisan based on these kinds of principles. And then the other thing that we have, and look, this is the most important thing. We're not just saying get rid of Obama and everything's going to be good. We're saying there's an opening, a potential for a post-Obama era where we can rebuild this country. We can make it a superpower again. Not a military superpower, but a superpower for justice and good in the world. By going back to the American system of economics, by going back to a national credit system, no more bailouts, no more Wall Street control, by investing in infrastructure at the high end of technology to create millions of jobs, and then go with a nuclear fusion crash program. That's the four basic laws: Glass-Steagall, credit policy, infrastructure, and fusion. Now we do that, people will be happy again. Americans will have a mission. We'll have a future for our children and grandchildren. You don't do that because you're afraid that it'll look bad if you come out against the president. I mean, it's ironic. These guys say such crap about Obama in private, including the Democrats. They hate him. And then they come up with excuses for not acting. That's what's wrong with America. We're a bunch of ignorant liars. Well, they should. Now, we need the people who are here tonight with us to take this message out. You know, get the material. We have material back there on the 4 laws, on impeachment, on everything I've talked about. We've got the webcast from last night, which people should see because it's the first time in a couple months that Lyndon LaRouche has done a webcast. And it's very effective. And we need financial help, and we need you to join us in organizing. So why don't we break up the meeting now, and thank you for your
The thing is,
attention.
the truth does hurt, but the lying is worse. But the truth pays off in the future.
Well, lying is going to kill us.
Yeah.
And accepting liars means that you no longer value the truth.
Truth hurts, but it pays off in the future.
Well, the truth doesn't have to hurt. The truth can liberate you.
Also on the 30th, we have a town hall meeting.
Well, over the last weeks and months, there's been a real focus on the 100th anniversary of the beginnings of World War I. And most of the discussion, and I should say, I don't know how much it's been in the United States. There hasn't been a whole lot in the United States, but in Europe it's discussed all the time. Because most of World War I was fought in a small area right around here, between France and Germany. But the point to looking at World War I is you have these very simple observations that are made, where people say, are we headed for the same situation? And you hear this aphorism, which is a somewhat useless comment, but it's repeated over and over and over, which is, those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it. And, you know, the lessons of history are not what most people think. And what I want to do is to demonstrate to you why it is that we're in a fight today, which is a continuation, almost an unbroken continuation, of war policies going back to the latter part of the 19th century. And that the real issue here is that unless we rid the planet of the concept of an empire, unless we establish regimes of sovereign nation states that function as republics, largely driven by our own nation, unless we do that, we're going to have a nuclear or thermonuclear World War III at some point in the maybe the weeks or days ahead, certainly within several months is the way things are going. So this is not just a history class or an object lesson, look how stupid they were then, we're acting just as stupid now, therefore ipso facto there's going to be war. It's that most people don't understand what causes wars. They don't understand why nations go to war. If you ask people today, you know, the president spends a lot of time attacking President Putin and making some very nasty and quite frankly, uneducated and foolish comments about the Russian president. Do you think they don't see this? They don't hear this? I mean, there's one case that I'll just give you an example. One of the witches at the State Department, and so they insisted that wages be driven down, that pensions be cut, that the Soviet Union went from having everything paid for by the state to nothing paid for by the state. That's why people die. You can't have that kind of transition. You need to have a transition which takes the elements of an economy that can function and puts them immediately in some kind of productive work as the basis of then driving the whole economy forward with the most advanced technology. And instead of doing that, shock therapy means you go in with a bunch of accountants and say, oh, you're paying $100 a month pensions, but you can't afford that in your budget, so we're going to cut it to 50 or 25. And someone might say, but people will starve. Well, you should have thought of that. You should have built your economy. You shouldn't have had communism. You blew it. We're going to put you under sound fiscal management. And so that's what happened in Eastern Europe. So in Ukraine, they'd gone up and down and back and forth, and they had a George Soros-funded revolt that put in a government with Yulia Tymoshenko, which looted the country like crazy. She became a billionaire. And then she was driven out and replaced by a guy named Yanukovych. And Yanukovych had his own problems. He wasn't that much better, but he was popularly elected. He was re-elected. And he was given a choice. He was asked to join the European Union, to have Ukraine join the European Union. And he looked at what was happening in the European Union. Now, what was happening in the European Union? Country after country was being put under bankers' dictatorship. Greece, which now has 60% unemployment for their youth, almost 30% unemployment for the population, in order to pay off their debt. How did they get so indebted, you might ask? Goldman Sachs came in and reorganized their debt, restructured their debt, so that they had to pay much more than they could afford And in order to pay it, they had to cut everything else. Same thing happened to Italy. Italy's in tremendous chaos right now. Spain, 50% youth unemployment in Spain. Portugal just had the third largest bank in the country collapse. I just got back from Europe, and I can tell you, when you talk to bankers there, they're one step away from heading for the hills. In Austria, there's a relatively small bank that was nationalized in 2009, but instead of writing off the bad debt, the government guaranteed it. Well, it just crashed again this summer. A spokeswoman named Pisaki. They're promoting these women who look like high school girls who are bloodthirsty lunatics. Maria Harf is another one. Samantha Power, who's our UN ambassador, is another one. But this Pisaki said the Russians are massing 20,000 troops on the Ukrainian border. And that's why we're concerned about Russia and Putin. And she goes into a whole thing. And then a reporter said, well, but these troops are 1,000 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. That's 600 miles. That's not exactly poised for a strike. And she said, well, our assessment is that they're right on the border and they're prepared to move. And then the reporter said, well, how far back should they be to not be a threat to Ukraine? In Siberia? You know, here's Ukraine, here's 600 kilometers. You know, here's where the reporter was asking, should they be posted here to not be a threat to Ukraine? Now, the point is that it's a stupid statement. And most of what we're hearing about Putin in the United States press is vile lies. And the question has to be raised, why are we subjected to this kind of propaganda? Why is it that on September 4th and 5th, NATO is going to have a summit in Wales? And the topic of the summit is going to be expanding NATO eastward up to the Russian border. Now, some of you who are older probably remember what NATO was formed to do. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What was NATO set up for? To stop the expansion of the Soviet Union at a point at which the Soviet Union had taken over all of Eastern Europe. And so the West formed an alliance to prevent Russia from taking West Germany, Austria, France, Netherlands, Belgium, and so on. Now, the Soviet Union collapsed 24 years ago. Russia went into a terrible crisis in the early 90s, provoked largely by the effort of the West to impose shock therapy on Russia. Russia had lost a large portion of its population. Older people died early because of hunger, disease. A lot of the younger people who could left Russia. There was a real shrinkage of the population of Russia. And there were agreements signed by George Herbert Walker Bush and by Clinton with Russia that said NATO would not expand eastward. And yet NATO has now added Poland. We now have NATO units in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They're trying to incorporate Ukraine. They're in Romania. So NATO has moved closer and closer to Russia. And what has Russia done to deserve this? Well, one of the things the Russians have been doing is they're fighting terrorists. They're fighting Islamic jihadist terrorists in Chechnya, in Georgia, South Ossetia, and other areas that are part of the Russian underbelly. And these terrorists are the same terrorists that we're supposedly fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. But when the Russians fight them, they're attacked for human rights violations. So the situation facing Russia is one in which, from their viewpoint, put yourself in the Russian viewpoint. Actually, let's think from the Russian viewpoint. What would you think? Well, I don't have the U.S. and Mexico up here. What would you think if instead of 60,000 Honduras and El Salvadorian children, you had 60,000 Russian troops moved to Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez and to Nuevo Laredo? Do you think there might be some concern in the United States about that? Do you remember we almost had nuclear war in 1962 when the Russians put some missiles in Cuba? Now, nations have a sense of defending their sovereignty, defending their people. That's all that Putin has been doing. And I'll go through in a few moments well, I'll go through right now. What happened in Ukraine? You had a government there that was broke. You've had bad governments in most of these countries after the Soviet Union fell because they had a problem. They didn't have capital. They didn't have the capability of building their countries, and they were hit immediately with shock therapy. Now, what shock therapy means is you can't spend state money to build the economy. You have to bring in private companies. But what happens with private companies? Why would a U.S. firm buy up a Russian railroad or a Ukrainian subway system or a loading dock on the Black Sea? Out of the goodness of their heart because they want to develop these countries? No, it's to make money. And the government of Austria is going to have to pay 6 billion euros to keep this bank functioning. The government of Austria total budget is 70 billion euros, so almost 10% of their total budget is going to have to go to pay off one bank. And meanwhile, people who had money in that bank, who were sold life insurance policies, which they were told, this is a good thing, they do this in the US, you get a life insurance policy, there's equity, if you die, your family gets money. 250,000 people bought these life insurance policies, which were just confiscated by the bank in what's called a bail-in, which means their money's gone, just like in Cyprus. And the bank is still insolvent. So you have a collapse going on. So Ukraine looked at this, and they said, well, we have $15 billion debt due right away. What kind of deal will you give us? And the IMF said, we'll give you $1.5 billion, 10% of that. And then if you carry out structural reforms, then we'll figure out how to negotiate the rest of it. In other words, if you cut everything, cut spending, cut every aspect of your budget, we'll give you 1/10 of what you need. So they called Putin. And Putin said, we'll give you the 15 billion. We'll give you oil for half price. We know you're in trouble. We'll help you out. And so Yanukovych, being a smart politician, said, okay, Vlad, come on over, let's sign the papers. And the European Union went crazy. They said, no, you're ours. You were supposed to sign with us. And so at that point, what was unleashed was a series of demonstrations. Now, some of the demonstrators were honest, well-meaning young people. They didn't like the fact that you've had one bad government after another. And they said, let's try and get a good government in there. We want democracy. They were told, you can have democracy. The U.S. will support you. And all of a sudden, armed thugs moved in on them. Not from the Ukrainian government, but from parties opposing the Ukrainian government, called the Right Sector and the Svoboda Party, who had verifiable connections to the Nazis in the 1940s, the Ukrainians who joined with Hitler's SS troops to wipe out Hungarians, Poles, Russians, and Jews in Ukraine. Their grandchildren, they still carry the banners of a man named Stefan Bandera, who was a war criminal, who was guilty of killing people working with the Nazi SS during World War II.